So for tonight's installment, I'm going to do something a little different. I will pick back up on the Black Death at the Golden Gate next time, but in an attempt to make it through my robust reading list, I want to come to Stephen King's The Shining tonight. This is something that I started a long time ago, several months anyway, and have just never gotten around to finishing. But if this can be a helpful outlet for that, then here we go. We're going to be starting on chapter 33, so just be advised of any spoilers. Chapter 33 is titled The Snowmobile. Sometime after midnight, while they all slept uneasily, the snow had stopped after dumping a fresh 8 inches on the old crust. The clouds had broken, a fresh wind had swept them away, and now Jack stood in a dusty ingot of sunlight which slanted through the dirty windows set into the eastern side of the equipment shed. The place was about as long as a freight car, and about as high. It smelled of grease and oil and gasoline and, faint nostalgic smell, sweet grass. 4 power lawnmowers were raked like soldiers on review against the south wall. 2 of them were the riding type that looked like small tractors. To their left were pothole diggers, round bladed shovels made for doing surgery on the putting green, a chainsaw, the electric hedge clippers, and a long, thin steel pole with a red flag at the top. "Caddy, fetch my ball in under 10 seconds and there's a quarter in it for you." "Yes, sir." Against the eastern wall, where the morning sun slanted in most strongly, 3 ping-pong tables leaned one against the other like a drunken house of cards. Their nets had been removed and flopped down from the shelf above. In the corner was a stack of shuffleboard weights in a roque set, the wickets banded together with twists of wire, the brightly painted balls in an egg carton sort of thing. Strange hens you have up here, Watson. Yes, you should see the animals down on the front lawn. Ha ha! And the mallets, 2 sets of them standing in their racks. He walked over to them, stepping over an old 8-cell battery which had once sat beneath the hood of the hotel truck, no doubt, and a battery charger, and a pair of J.C. Penney jumper cables coiled between them. He slipped one of the short-handed mallets out of the front rack and held it up in front of his face, like a knight bound for battle saluting his king. Fragments of his dream, it was all jumbled now, fading, recurred. Something about George Hatfield and his father's cane, just enough to make him uneasy, and absurdly enough, a trifle guilty about holding a plain old garden variety roque mallet. Not that roque was such a common garden variety game anymore. Its more modern cousin, croquet, was much more popular now, a child's version of the game at that. Roque, however, that must have been quite a game. Jack had found a millweed rule book down in the basement from one of the years in the early 20s when a North American roque tournament had been held at the Overlook. Quite a game. Schizo. He frowned a little, then smiled. Yes, it was a schizo sort of game at that. The mallet expressed that perfectly. A soft end, a hard end, the game of finesse and aim, and game of raw, bludgeoning power. He swung the mallet through the air. He smiled a little at the powerful whistling sound it made. Then he replaced it in the rack and turned to his left. What he saw there made him frown again. The snowmobile sat almost in the middle of the equipment shed, a fairly new one, and Jack didn't care for its looks at all. Bombardier Ski-Doo was written on one side of the engine, cowling facing him in black letters which had been raked backward, presumably to connote speed. The protruding skis were also black. There was black piping to the right and left of the cowling, what they would call racing stripes on a sports car. But the actual paint job was a bright, sneering yellow, and that was what he didn't like about it. Sitting there in its shaft of morning sun, yellow body and black piping, black skis and black upholstered open cockpit, it looked like a monstrous mechanized wasp. When it was running, it would sound like that too, whining and buzzing and ready to sting. But then what else should it look like? It wasn't flying under false colors, at least, because after all, it had done its job. Because after it had done its job, they were going to be hurting plenty, all of them. By spring, the Torrance family would be hurting so badly that what those wasps had done to Danny's hand would look like a mother's kiss. He pulled his handkerchief from his back pocket, wiped his mouth with it, and walked over to the skidoo. He stood looking down at it, the frown very deep now, and stuffed his handkerchief back into his pocket. Outside, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the equipment shed, making it rock and creak. He looked out the window and saw the gust carrying a sheet of sparkling snow crystals toward the drifted in rear of the hotel, whirling them high into the hard blue sky. The wind dropped and he went back to looking at the machine. It was a disgusting thing, really. You almost expected to see a long, limber stinger protruding from its rear. He had always disliked the goddamn snowmobiles. They shivered They shivered the cathedral of silence of winter into a million rattling fragments. They startled the wildlife. They sent out huge and pollutive clouds of blue and billowing oil smoke behind them. Cough, cough, gag, gag, let me breathe. They were perhaps the final grotesque toy of the unwinding fossil fuel age, given the 10-year-olds for Christmas. He remembered a newspaper article he had read in Stovington, a story datelined someplace in Maine. A kid on a snowmobile, barrel-assing up a road he'd never traveled before at better than 30 miles an hour. Night. His headlight was off. There had been a heavy chain strung between two posts with the no trespassing sign hung from the middle. They said that in all probability the kid never saw it. The moon might have gone behind a cloud. The chain had decapitated him. Reading the story, Jack had been almost glad, and now, looking at this machine, the feeling recurred. If it wasn't for Danny, I would take great pleasure in grabbing one of those mallets, opening the cowling, and just pounding until... He let his pent-up breath escape him in a long, slow sigh. Wendy was right. Come hell or high water, or the welfare line, Wendy was right. Pounding this machine to death would be the height of folly, no matter how pleasant an aspect that folly made. It would almost be tantamount to pounding his own son to death. Fucking Luddite, he said aloud. He went to the back of the machine and unscrewed the gas cap. He found a dipstick on one of the shelves that ran at chest high around the wall and slipped it in. The last eighth of an inch came out wet. Not very much, but enough to see if the damn thing would run. Later, he could siphon more from the Volks in the hotel truck. He screwed the cap back on and opened the cowling. No spark plugs, no battery. He went to the shelf again and began to poke along it, pushing aside screwdrivers and adjustable wrenches, a one-lung carburetor that had been taken out of an old lawnmower, plastic boxes of screws and nails and bolts of varying sizes. The shelf was thick and dark with old grease, and the year's accumulation of dust had stuck to it like fur. He didn't like touching it. He found a small oil-stained box with the abbreviation SKID, laconically marked on it in pencil. He shook it and something rattled inside. Plugs. He held one of them up to the light, trying to estimate the gap without hunting around for the gapping tool. Fuck it, he thought resentfully, and just dropped the plug back into the box. If the gap's wrong, that's just too damn bad. Tough fucking titty. There was a tool behind the door. He dragged it over, sat down, and installed the 4 spark plugs, then fitted the small rubber caps over each. That done, he let his fingers play briefly over the magneto. They laughed when I sat down at the piano. Back to the shelves. This time he couldn't find what he was wanted, a small battery, a 3 or 4 cell. There were socket wrenches, a case filled with drills and drill bits, bags of lawn fertilizer and Vigoro for the flower beds, but no snowmobile battery. It didn't bother him in the slightest. In fact, it made him feel glad. He was relieved. I did my best, Captain, but I could not get through. That's fine, son. I'm going to put you in for the Silver Star and the Purple Snowmobile. You're a credit to your regiment. Thank you, sir. I did try. He began to whistle Red River Valley up-tempo as he poked along the last 2 or 3 feet of shelf. The notes came out in little puffs of white smoke. He had made a complete circuit of the shed, and the thing wasn't there. Maybe somebody had lifted it. Maybe Watson had. He laughed aloud. The old office bootleg trick. A few paper clips, a couple of reams of paper. Nobody will miss this tablecloth or this Golden Regal place setting. And what about the fine snowmobile battery? Yes, that might come in handy. Toss it in the sack. White-collar crime, baby. Everybody has sticky fingers. Under the jacket discount, we used to call it when we were kids. He walked back to the snowmobile and gave the side of it a good, healthy kick as he went by. Well, that was the end of it. He would just have to tell Wendy, sorry, baby, but there was a box sitting in the corner by the door. The stool had been right over it. Written on top in pencil was the abbreviation, SKID. He looked at it, the smile drying on his lips. Look, sir, it's the cavalry. Looks like your smoke signals must have worked after all. It wasn't fair. God damn it, it just wasn't fair. Something, luck, fate, providence, had been trying to save him. Some other luck, white luck. And at the last moment, bad old Jack Torrance, luckhead, stepped back in. The lousy run of cards wasn't over yet. Resentment, a gray, sullen wave of it, pushed up his throat. His hands had clenched into fists again. Not fair, goddammit. Not fair. Why couldn't he have looked someplace else? Any place? Why hadn't he had a crick in his neck, or an itch on his nose, or the need to blink? Just one of those little things. He never would have seen it. Well, he hadn't. That was all. It was a hallucination. No different from what had happened yesterday outside the room on the 2nd floor, or the goddamn hedge menagerie. A momentary strain, that was all. Fancy, I thought I saw a snowmobile battery in that corner. Nothing there now. Combat fatigue, I guess, sir. Sorry. Keep your pecker up, son. It happens to all of us sooner or later. He yanked the door open, almost hard enough to snap the hinges, and pulled his snowshoes inside. They were clotted with snow, and he slapped them down hard enough on the floor to raise a cloud of it. He put his left foot on the shoe and paused. Danny was out there by the milk platform, trying to make a snowman by the looks. Not much luck. The snow was too cold to stick together. Still, he was giving it the good old college try, out there in the flashing morning, a speck of a bundled boy above the brilliant snow and below the brilliant sky, wearing his hat turned around backward like Carlton Fisk. What in the name of God were you thinking of? The answer came back with no pause. Me. I was thinking of me. He suddenly remembered lying in bed the night before, lying there, and suddenly he had been contemplating the murder of his wife. In that instant, kneeling there, everything came clear to him. It was not just Danny the Overlook was working on. It was working on him, too. It wasn't Danny who was the weak link. It was him. He was the vulnerable one, the one who could be bent and twisted until something snapped. Until I let go and sleep. And when I do that, if I do that. He looked up at the banks of windows, and the sun threw back an almost blinding glare from their many paned surfaces. But he looked anyway. For the first time he noticed how much they seemed like eyes. They reflected away the sun and held their own darkness within. It was not Danny they were looking at. It was him. In those few seconds he understood everything. There was a certain black and white picture he remembered seeing as a child in catechism class. The nun had presented it to them on an easel and called it a miracle of God. The class had looked at it blankly, seeing nothing but a jumble of whites and blacks, senseless and patternless. Then one of the children in the 3rd row gasped, "It's Jesus!" And that child had gone home with a brand new Testament, and also a calendar because he had been first. The others stared even harder, Jackie Torrance among them. One by one, the other kids had given a similar gasp, the little girl transported in near ecstasy, crying out shrilly, "I see him! I see him!" She had also been rewarded with a Testament. At last, everyone had seen the face of Jesus in the jumble of blacks and whites except Jackie. He strained harder and harder, scared now, part of him cynically thinking that everyone else was simply putting on to please Sister Beatrice, part of him secretly convinced that he wasn't seeing it because God had decided he was the worst sinner in the class. "Don't you see it, Jackie?" Sister Beatrice had asked him in her sad, sweet manner. "I see your tits," he had thought in vicious desperation. He began to shake his head, then faked excitement and said, "Yes, I do. Wow, it is Jesus." And everyone in the class had laughed and applauded him, making him feel triumphant, ashamed, and scared. Later, when everyone else had tumbled their way up from the church basement and out onto the street, he had lingered behind, looking at the meaningless black and white jumble that Sister Beatrice had left on the easel. He hated it. They had made it up. They had all made it up the way he had, even Sister herself. It was a big fake. "Shitfire, hellfire, shitfire," he had whispered under his breath, and as he turned to go, he had seen the face of Jesus from the corner of his eye, sad and wise. He turned back, his heart in his throat. Everything had suddenly clicked into place, and he had stared at the picture with fearful wonder, unable to believe he had missed it. The eyes, the zigzag shadow across the careworn brow, the fine nose, the compassionate lips. Looking at Jackie Torrance, what had only been a meaningless sprawl had suddenly been transformed into a stark black and white etching of the face of Christ our Lord. Fearful wonder became terror. He had cussed in front of a picture of Jesus. He would be damned. He would be in hell with the sinners. The face of Christ had been in the picture all along. All along. These sentences are just so long, so apologies if I'm struggling here a little bit. Now, kneeling in the sun and watching his son playing in the shadow of the hotel, he knew that it was all true. The hotel wanted Danny, maybe all of them, but Danny for sure. The Hedges had really walked. There was a dead woman in 217, a woman that was perhaps only a spirit and harmless under most circumstances, but a woman who is now in active danger. Like some malevolent clockwork toy, she had been wound up and set in motion by Danny's own odd mind, and his own. It had been Watson who had told him a man had dropped dead of a stroke one day on the rope court. Or had it been Olnett? It didn't matter. There had been an assassination on the 3rd floor. How many old quarrels, suicides, strokes, how many murders? Was Grady lurking somewhere in the West Wing with his axe, just waiting for Danny to start him up so he could come back out of the woodwork? The puffed circle of bruises around Danny's neck, the twinkling, half-seen bottles in the deserted lounge, the radios, the dreams, the scrapbook he had found in the cellar. "Medoc, are you here? I've been sleepwalking again, my dear." He got up suddenly, thrusting the snowshoes back out the door. He was shaking all over. He slammed the door and picked up the box with the battery in it. It slipped through his shaking fingers. Oh Christ, what if I cracked it? He pulled the flaps of the carton open and yanked the battery out, heedless of the acid that might be leaking through the battery's casing if it had cracked. But it hadn't. It was whole. A little sigh escaped his lips. Cradling it, he took it over to the skidoo and put it on its platform near the front of the engine. He found a small adjustable wrench on one of the shelves and attached the battery cables quickly and with no trouble. The battery was live, no need to use the charger on it. There had been a crackle of electricity and a small odor of ozone when he slipped the positive cable into its terminal. The job done, he stood away, wiping his hands nervously on his faded denim jacket. There, it should work. No reason why not. No reason at all except that it was part of the Overlook, and the Overlook really didn't want them out of here. No, not at all. The Overlook was having one hell of a good time. There was a little boy to terrorize, a man and his woman to set one another against, and if it played its cards right, they could end up fitting through the Overlook's halls like insubstantial shades in a Shirley Jackson novel. Whatever walked in Hill House walked alone. But you wouldn't be alone in the overlook. Oh no, there was plenty of company here. But there was really no reason why the snowmobile shouldn't start. Except, of course, he still really didn't want to go. Yes, except for that. He stood looking at the ski-doo, his breath puffing out in little frozen plumes. He wanted it to be the way it had been. When he had come in here, he had no doubts. Going down would be the wrong decision. He had known that then. Wendy was only scared of the boogeyman summoned up by a single hysterical little boy. Now, suddenly, he could see her side. It was like his play, his damnable play. He no longer knew which side he was on or how things should come out. Once you saw the face of a god in those jumbled blacks and whites, it was everybody out of the pool. You could never unsee it. Others might laugh and just say it's nothing, just a lot of splotches with no meaning. Give me a good old craftsmaster paint by the numbers any day. But you would always see the face of Christ our Lord looking at you. You had seen it in one gestalt leap. The conscious and unconscious melding in that one shocking moment of understanding. You would always see it. You were damned to always see it. I've been sleepwalking again, my dear. It had been all right until he had seen Danny playing in the snow. It was Danny's fault. Everything had been Danny's fault. He was the only one with the shining, or whatever it was. It wasn't a shining, it was a curse. If he and Wendy had been here alone, they could have passed the winter nicely. No pain, no strain on the brain. Don't want to leave? Can't? The Overlook didn't want them to go, and he didn't want them to go either. Not even Danny. Maybe he was a part of it now. Perhaps the Overlook, large and rambling Samuel Johnson that it was, had picked him to be its Boswell. You say the new caretaker writes? Very good, sign him on. Time we told our side. Let's get rid of that woman and his snot-nosed kid first, however. We don't want him to be distracted. We don't. He was standing by the snowmobile cockpit, his head starting to ache again. What did it come down to, go or stay? Very simple. Keep it simple. Shall we stay or go? If we go, how long will it be before you find the local hole in Sidewinder? A voice asked him. The dark place with the lousy color TV that unshaven and unemployed men spent the day watching game shows on, where the piss in the men's room smells 2,000 years old, and there's always a sodden camel butt unraveling in the toilet bowl, where the beer is 30 cents a glass and you cut it with salt and the jukebox is loaded with 70 country oldies. How long? Christ, he was so afraid it wouldn't be long at all. I can't win, he said very softly. That was it. It was like trying to play solitaire with one of the aces missing from the deck. Abruptly, he leaned over the Sea-Doo's motor compartment and yanked off the magneto. It came off with sickening ease. He looked at it for a moment, then went to the equipment shed's back door and opened it. From here, the view of the mountains was unobstructed, picture postcard beautiful in the twinkling brightness of the morning. An unbroken field of snow rose to the first pines about a mile distant. He flung the magneto as far out into the snow as he could. It went much farther than it should have. There was a slight puff of snow when it fell. The light breeze carried the snow granules away to fresh resting places. Disperse there, I say. There's nothing to see. It's all over. Disperse. He felt at peace. Jack stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing the good mountain air, and then he closed it firmly and went back out the other door to tell Wendy they would be staying. On the way, he stopped and had a snowball fight with Danny. So the way King writes, he has these parentheticals inserted. I mean, if you've read Stephen King, that might be common, but that's kind of why sometimes it sounds a little choppier. Yeah, these parentheticals. So I need to try to figure out a way to convey that better. So in any case, that concludes chapter 23. We'll pick this back up another time.